But what's that? Or that was the
That was just
the end of the sentiment.
The random observation.
Well, you're quite observant and correct. That is the case.
All right, so Mon.
Hey, Catherine, can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Beautiful, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Ken.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Do you have their cell or email? Copy this straight from.
There he is. Good morning, Bill. How are you?
Oh, sorry. If you're good. He's muted.
You're muted, friend.
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you, and good morning to you, Guy.
Are you getting snow up in Montreat?
Oh, we just had flurries this morning. That was it. Nothing really stuck. So we're good. In fact, we're traveling today back to Decatur since we resume in-person teaching starting tomorrow. So
Wow.
I'm looking forward to that and being mindful of keeping safe, and we're masking, of course, and keeping our distance, but this will be our official time to go back to in-person teaching.
I understand that the president resigned. Have they appointed an interim president yet?
No, we are right now in the search for our new president. So the
idea is that there won't be an interim. It'll just
no interim. It's full speed ahead, and we expect to have an announcement sometime by the end of April.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are you on that committee?
No, I'm not. But we get apprised on a regular basis on how things are progressing.
Wow, what a turnover for all the, I mean, Louisville was a year or so ago, and then Princeton, Craig just announced, and of course,
Right.
Austin is.
Austin, right. Yep.
I
Yep.
can't imagine that Brian is many years behind.
Right.
So it's quite.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It is. It is. Right now, we're all in competition for the ideal president.
exactly. Which is a job I don't think I would want.
No, I don't have the for
Yeah.
for
No,
sure.
just
I
amazing.
would prefer just to keep writing and teaching, or teaching and writing, whichever comes first.
Yeah. What are you teaching this semester?
So I'm teaching one class on the book of Genesis. It's an exegesis class. So we're translating and exegeting for that. And then I'm teaching the second half of the intro course to the Old Testament.
Well, that doesn't sound overly taxing of a academic calendar.
No. We have about 40 students in the intro class, and I have 8 students in my exegesis class. So
Wow.
it's
Great.
pretty manageable. Yes.
It was Bernard Anderson your primary when we were at Princeton, or I know he retired, I think, after my first year, but that would have been your Miller year, wouldn't it have been?
At least, yeah. Actually, I took his Old Testament theology course, but he was no longer teaching the intro course, and that was taught by Jimmy Jack Roberts.
Yeah.
And Jim Butler. Do you remember Jim Butler? He was a PhD student at the time.
I don't remember him.
Yeah, he co-taught that with Jimmy Jack. Really good. And he wound up at Fuller, and he's been teaching at Fuller for many, many, many years, but he never did finish his dissertation.
Oh gosh, ABV. Oh, yeah, that's yeah, and I was so sorry that I never had Pat. I came to know him, but I graduated, I guess, right before he came. I think he came and then was granted a sabbatical or something like that, and
I took his first class the year I graduated, and it was on the Psalms.
Yeah,
and so,
I bet he started the year that I was on internship.
Yes.
Granted a sabbatical.
Yes.
But I remember he was gone that summer, and so he was gone in '86. Anyway.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned Pat, because this coming weekend in Montreat is a Psalms symposium dedicated to the work of Pat Miller, and so I'm a part of that. So I'm traveling back to Decatur tomorrow, and then coming back up on Friday to participate in this conference.
Does the family still own his home?
As far as I know, yes. As far as I know, yeah, I think so. Yeah, and of course, and Mary Bruggeman is here, and she's the one who's sort of spearheading it, or at least she's in the background, having inspired this symposium. So, yeah, should be good.
Anything published out of it, or is it?
No. In fact, it was an interesting process. There was an invitation sent out, I think, in Presbyterians Today and several other publications, inviting pastors and students to submit
Right, I saw that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's what this is about. So I was part of the panel review committee, and we selected 5 out of, it must have been about 70 or 80 submissions.
Wow.
And so they're here to present in workshop format what they proposed. And we have several main speakers, including Marvin Tell from Princeton. Yeah, so he's going to be leading worship. And we have Nora Tisdale and Brent Strawn now at Duke. And then we have a panel of a discussion panel on new directions in Psalms research, and I'm leading that. So it'll be a lot of fun. It'll be a Psalms fest, a Psalms love fest in honor of Pat Miller.
A festschrift for, yeah.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I think what Martin did with that hymnal was such a gift to the church. I'm so grateful he did that.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
My one, not only, but sort of my one gnat bite about our new hymnals is that they took the, didn't follow what had been done in the blue hymnal, which was group all the Psalms settings in the hymnal together. And in the new hymnal, I've dispersed them, and it's not quite as easy to.
That's
to
right.
find. You can go to the back of the hymnal certainly and find them.
Right, right. Yes.
I really like having them all together. So.
Yes, I do too. I do too.
Well, I anticipate we'll have a few more people show up. We had some baptism in the early service, and so church is letting out a little bit late. But let me also, Alec, can I have you close the doors for me? There's a lot of ambient noise. We're in a different room this week, which is different than the room we were supposed to be in, and different from the room we got shuttled to last week. So we still haven't fixed the problems that caused us to be out of the fellowship hall, but we'll go ahead and get started as well. Welcome to those who are online. We hopefully will have a few more show up as well. But I want to thank my friend Bill Brown, who's at Columbia Seminary and has a new book out on the Psalms. And we'll hear a little bit more about that today. So Bill, welcome. Let me let you, and I guess let me, I guess I need to have you be co-host. And then you are able to take it from there. And Alec, what is the best way to, I got him as co-host. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
But how do I get him as speaker view?
So
Like
he's
that.
already for them, they hear.
Oh, great, perfect.
Before you can use it.
Whoops. Good. All right. You're good, Bill.
All right. Thank you, Guy. And Guy, it says that you're muted, but I think your voice will still come through because you must have a common microphone in the room that's picking up your voice, and that's how I'm hearing you. But you are Zoom-wise muted, and you've been muted all this time. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be back here at Westminster Pres with you nomads. You all are nomadically moving from one room to the next, evidently, and so you're in a new room. I'm in my same room, which is the living room in my house in Montreat. So I greet you from Montreat, North Carolina, where we've had just a little bit of snow, some flurries this morning, but nothing really sticking. So we begin now with our second installment on dialogue and the Psalms. And I'd like to begin in prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for gathering us together from near and far. We give you thanks that you have given us the privilege and blessing to study your ancient word, a word that comes in many forms, from prose to poetry, from lament to praise, all there in one canonical unity. And we give you thanks that your word, the words of ancient times, speaks to us today. May we find relevance. May we find wisdom and insight from your word, O God, that accompanies us through thick and thin, accompanied by the living word, in whom we ask this, Jesus Christ, the word made flesh and fresh among us. Amen. All right. Well, our second foray into the rich diversity of the Bible with a focus on the Psalms. And so I want to present a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation as we move now into the Psalms of Lament. Last week, I presented sort of an overview of the diversity of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, noting the diversity of genres, of styles, of modes of communication, and theological diversity as well. The Bible is its own e pluribus unum, one out of many. And many voices are there in the Bible. The Bible does not speak with one voice, but a variety of voices, and some of them are in tension with each other. One image to me that I have found helpful over the years, if we can imagine the Bible as sort of a choir, all singing, but some of it is dissonant. Some of the, it's not entirely harmonious, but all of them are singing to God in praise as well as in lament, and they are singing loudly. So the Bible is sort of a dissonant chorus, all directed to God, but for our edification as readers and listeners, and perhaps even singers. And the Psalms, in fact, were meant to be sung. Many of the superscriptions that we find in the Psalter refer to musical melodies that we can no longer reconstruct, but there they are. So I want to focus on one set or one kind or type of Psalms frequently called the Psalms of Lament. And they delve deeply into expressing anguish and grief, as well as grievance. In fact, it's perhaps no coincidence that the Lament Psalms are the most dominant type of Psalms in the Psalter. We typically think of the Psalms as Psalms of praise, hymns, the hymn book of ancient Israel. But again, the most dominant form of the Psalms is the lament, or sometimes called the complaint Psalms, because they deal with expressing grief and complaint about how life is hard. So, and the lament Psalms, and I love this painting, famous painting by Edvard Munch, The Scream. And for me, it is quite reflective and indicative of the spirit of the lament. It's a screaming to God and to the community of pain, anguish, anxiety, hardship. And so I submit the Psalms of Lament that we will discuss this morning as a word for such a time as this. I suspect that you have all found yourself lamenting, particularly these last 2.5 years, coming up to 3 years, and for a variety of reasons. So I simply ask you to reflect on for what shall we lament today? What causes us anguish, fear, uncertainty? What causes us to cry out? What causes us to pray to God fervently? For what shall we lament? Whatever you identify as a reason for lamenting, I think we can all agree that the pandemic is certainly one reason to lament the past 2 years. And this quote from Dr. Ali Muqdad, I think captures it quite well. This will be a sad day in our history. Our grandchildren and future generations will look back at us and blame us for the biggest failure in facing a pandemic in the country that is the richest country in the world, that we allowed people to die, that we didn't protect our vulnerable populations, Native American, Hispanic, and African Americans, that we did not protect our essential workers. Those whom Dr. Muqdad named are those who suffered the most these past 2 years. Indeed, a time for lament. And it was a time for lament for ancient Israel as well, which suffered great hardship, including exile, deportation, destruction of their temple by the Babylonians, not to mention natural disasters like famine and flooding. The ancient community that we call Israel from the Bible suffered greatly, many disruptions. And we can name a lot of disruptions that have plagued our lives these past 2 years and before then as well. The lament in the Psalms, the lament in the Bible, makes this move from expressing grief to submitting grievance, or what I call from personal anguish to protest. And so we're going to study some Psalms this morning that reflects the image of the scream, as well as the image of the fist in protest. And so we begin with what has been called the prototypical Psalm of Lament in the Bible. It is short, the structure is straightforward, and it plumbs a level of poignancy that simply cannot be forgotten. And it begins this way, with a series of questions. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I hold counsels with my soul, agony in my heart? Daily? How long must my enemy prevail over me? So these are the first 3 verses of Psalm 13, all beginning with the same question. How long, how long, how long? 4 times, no less. That question is not asked out of curiosity. The psalmic speaker is not asking for a timetable so much as simply an accounting of God to rectify this situation. The speaker feels forgotten. The speaker feels neglected by God. The speaker feels isolated. And the speaker complains of conflict. How long must my enemy prevail over me? In fact, if one were able to plot out a spectrum of suffering here, it would be the whole gamut, from the theological to the social and the psychological. Notice that the psalmic speaker begins by complaining about God's negligence. Will you forget me forever? And then this agonizing anxiety within oneself, within the person's heart. And then the complaint of conflict and being the brunt of perhaps violence. How long must my enemy prevail over me? So we have the theological, we have the psychological, and we have the social, concluding with some sense of persecution by an unnamed enemy. I'm giving this psalm to you in the NBV version. You may not be familiar with that. You're more familiar with the NRSV or the NIV or the King James Version. But the NBV version is the new Brown version. It's my translation. And so we move on. Look and answer me, O Lord my God. Restore light to my eyes, or else I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him. And my foes will rejoice over my downfall. And so the psalm has shifted from complaint to God, how long, how long, how long, to almost summoning God to be attentive, to take note, look and answer me, to respond. And so this part is the petition. Restore light to my eyes, or else I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice over my downfall. So we move from complaint to petition. But that's not all. The psalm concludes with these two verses. But as for me, I trust in your benevolence. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I shall sing for joy to the Lord once the Lord has done me good. So endeth the 13th Psalm of the Psalter. And this is typical of many laments in the Psalms by virtue of the movement that begins with complaint and ends with trust and praise. In fact, if we outlined it, the structure of the lament begins with this initial cry to God to take notice, the invocation, how long, O Lord? And then the complaint, which describes the speaker's suffering. And in this case, in this very short psalm, we see a whole range of suffering described by the speaker. And then in the third, there's the petition, O Lord, restore light to my eyes. Then finally, an expression of confidence, but as for me, I trust in your benevolence, O God, and this vow to praise, or an assurance of praise at the end. Really, 5 steps are taken from the invocation and complaint to the vow of praise. In fact, I've color-coded this now just to illustrate to you the different parts of the lament psalm. How long, O Lord? There's the invocation. Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? That in green, that is the complaint or the lament proper. And then in white, towards the middle, consider or look and answer me, O Lord my God, give light to my eyes. This is the petition or the plea, which continues into the sort of amber colored part, which I will get back to in a moment. But if we go to the blue, but as for me, but I trusted in your steadfast love or benevolence, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. There's the expression of trust or confidence. Then finally, in yellow, I will sing to the Lord when God deals bountifully with me. This, by the way, is more of the NRSV translation compared to the NBV version. So there's a slight difference. But overall, the meaning and the spirit is the same. I wanted to highlight this amber part. And I'm circling that here using my magic marker, which I've come to love in doing PowerPoint presentations over Zoom. So the white part is the plea or the petition. But notice what happens when the speaker launches into this amber part, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. This may sound a little awkward, but what the speaker is doing is bargaining with God. The speaker is motivating God to action by pointing out to God what will happen if God does not respond. Death, victory by the enemy. Those are the two things that the speaker points out to God will happen if God does not respond, if God does not give light to the speaker's eyes, that is to restore his life. This is what sometimes called the motivation clause. The speaker is doing his or her level best to motivate God to action by pointing out to God what will happen. What will happen otherwise? What will happen if God does not respond? If God remains negligent, then the speaker says, I'm going to die. And behind that statement is this assumption by the speaker that God does not want the speaker to die. God does not want the enemy to prevail, because the speaker is assuming that his enemy is also God's enemy. The speaker is also assuming that if God lets the speaker die, by not responding, then God is going to lose something. God is going to lose the praise that the speaker promises to give to God. The speaker is assuming that God loves praises, and the Psalms are all about God loving the praises of God's people. And the speaker points out that, oh God, if you let me go away, if you let me fade away into death, or if you let me be killed by my enemy, then you will lose one person in that choir that is praising you. Other Psalms talk about the absence of praise in death, that there is no longer praise given from Sheol, which is the Hebrew word for the underworld, which is translated in the Greek Septuagint as Hades. There is no sense of the resurrection here in the Psalms. So the speaker's only recourse is to pray to God that God will respond and save his life from the conflict, from the suffering at hand. Otherwise, God will lose a praise person. God will lose a praiser as well as a prayer. And God does not want that, according to the speaker. This is typical of the Psalms of Lament in the Bible. And I ask you, have you ever prayed this way to God? Praying by complaining? Praying by sort of bargaining? And praying by promising to praise God when God comes through? I submit to you, or at least it's been my experience in the Presbyterian Church, that we don't offer these kinds of prayers to God. Which is to say that we normally do not lament to God, at least the way in which the Psalms lament. In fact, what seems to be particularly awkward about these lament Psalms is that there's rarely any reference to sin and confession. Now, there are 7 Psalms that are called Penitential Psalms. Psalm 6, 32, 38, 51 may be the most familiar to you, 102, 130, and 143. They are called by the church the Penitential Psalms because they do acknowledge sin. But when it comes to the confession of sin, we only have these Psalms in all of the 150 Psalms, 32, 38, 51, and 130. 51 is the psalm that is ascribed to David when he prayed after being caught by Nathan of committing an adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and for killing her husband in battle. And so that is perhaps the most anguished penitential Psalms. That's all about confessing sin before God. So that's the exception that sort of proves the rule with the lament Psalms. Normally, the lament Psalms don't talk about sin. In Psalm 13, there was no confession of sin. But we Presbyterians love to confess sin. It's an important part of our worship service. So I challenge you, as I have challenged myself in understanding the Psalms of the Psalter. In fact, I'm writing a commentary on the Psalms, so I'm always immersed in the Psalms and simply wondering why it is that the church today, and I'm speaking particularly Presbyterians, why we do not do more to lament. We do plenty to confess, and I'm not disparaging the confession of sin. It's part of the Presbyterian DNA to confess sin. And I think that's a good thing. But we do not lament. We do not get angry. We're very polite when it comes to our prayers to God. And so I taught a class on the Psalms a year ago. And that was when we were suffering the height of the pandemic. And so I asked students to write their own lament, given the times in which we live, and to do it, patterning it after Psalm 13. And I received one version from a student that really caught my attention. And I am, with his permission, sharing that with you this morning. It is a psalm written from this student a year ago. And so I'd love to share that with you. I'm going to read it to you. How long, O Lord, will this pandemic continue? 40 years or more? How long will your people disregard the necessary safety measures to stop the spread of this nefarious foe? How long must I suffer from anxiety and fear because of the carelessness of others? Whether they know it or not, I count them as my enemies because of their indifference, claiming their rights to do what they please. Whom can I trust, O Lord, except my closest family, who do their best to keep as safe as I, while others roam around like packs of dogs, socially gathering, not caring about others or even about themselves. But I envy them as much as I despise them. I too yearn to gather together and enjoy close company, to hug and hold hands, to speak face to face, to worship together in one place. But I cannot, because I want to survive this scourge as I look forward to the day when it is over. Preserve me, O Lord, from the virus, and save me from my own anger and fear. Protect me and my family. Save us from the virus. What do you gain by our deaths, O God? Not to mention the deaths of hundreds of thousands. O Lord, I trust in you. I trust that you value my life, such that you would want me to live to continue serving you in this life. Oh, when the day comes when COVID is vanquished, I shall sing for joy to you in the fellowship of my community. Let me ask this. Can you identify with this psalm, at least of a year ago or 2 years ago? Are there any parts that really strike a deep chord within you? Maybe parts that still do. Anyway, this is an example of one of us who tapped into the spirit of an ancient psalm and came out with a lament that I think does speak to many of us today, or at least a year ago. Yes, with cases of the Omicron virus declining, and church coming back together, as you all, there does seem to be a sense that we're finally getting on the other side of this virus. But in the height of that, and it still continues, there's been plenty of conflict over, yes, vaccine mandates and face masking and all that. And this lament expresses deep anguish and disappointment and rage over the fact that one would think that with a common enemy, we would all be united to vanquish this nefarious foe. But no. And so this student who expresses so well the spirit of Psalm 13 for such a time as this captures that whole range of emotion, disappointment, anguish, anger, rage even, and hope. And in the midst of all of that, trust and an anticipation of praise. I think this is a great example of how to pray the Psalms in a modern key, in our own context. And I encourage you to try your hand at this as well. And let me ask this. I don't know how Westminster Presbyterian Church has both suffered and survived the past 2.5 years now. But do you recall any times and opportunities to truly lament in worship or in your own prayer life throughout these 2.5 years? And let me throw this question to Guy. Guy, do you feel that in worship through Zoom these past 2 years, have there been enough opportunity to truly lament in the spirit of the psalmist as we see reflected here?
We've done some, Bill, but I don't know that we've done enough. I know one of the things that I had suggested at staff, and it didn't get any traction, was I was feeling really the need, and I think it was maybe last summer, of all of the deaths that we had, we've only lost 2 members because of COVID in this period. Both were, we just lost one recently. She was in her 90s. The other one was in her 90s and contracted it in a nursing home. We've had members who've had family members die, but immediate to the congregation, we've not.
Yeah.
But we've lost a number of very important members, and we couldn't have funerals.
Right.
And that was so hard on my part. I think of one of the very first ones was Dr. Tom Graham, who was chief cardiac pediatric cardiologist at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. And it was the first funeral after we shut down the church. The church would have been overflowing for people coming to celebrate his life and witness. There were 5 of his family members in the first pew. And then Donovan and I set up cameras so that the rest of his family, stretching from Boston to Vancouver, British Columbia, could participate. And I was grateful we could do that for that family, but not to have the community grieving the loss of this love. And there probably been 15 others that we've lost similarly. And I thought it would have been nice to somehow invite the families and acknowledge that in worship on a Sunday morning. We did that, to some extent at All Saints Day when we read all the names, but to me, I almost wanted a service that kind of focused and named that, and we never ended up doing that, and I was sorry for that. But I don't know. What about you all in the class?
I must just to tell you that when I turn on the news almost every night, and you hear the complaints of different people. Why are we wearing masks? Why are we not wearing masks?
Yeah.
Why are people not getting vaccinated?
Yeah.
Isn't that sort of a
lament.
song of lament,
Yeah.
although it's not toward God? We now are lamenting toward public officials or the news or whatever. So we've moved the focus of the lament, but I think there's plenty of lament going on the radio, TV, in public places.
Yeah. Could you hear that, Bill?
I did. Thank you. That really brings up an interesting question, and that is, how do we deal with our anger? There's a lot of anger out there, whether it's towards the unvaccinated who refuse to be vaccinated, or those who are reacting against mandates and draconian and heavy-handed ways to get people vaccinated. So there's a lot of anger, and the gentleman who just commented on that by just catching the news on a daily basis. It points to the issue of how to handle and direct anger. Do we lash out against each other? Sometimes in unjustified ways. What does the psalmist do about that? The psalmist's anger is directed towards God, at least here in Psalm 13. And there is anger directed toward the enemy, but the enemy is not the one who's addressed here. It is God. And that's something that I think the psalmist encourages us to explore. Using God to vent our anger may be actually a very healthy way of expressing anger, not to mention expressing anger in ways that are constructive to each other and rather than destructive. But the psalmist is suggesting if you're holding anger in over things that you cannot control, which is so much these days, then begin with God. God is big enough to handle our anger. And then maybe in the process of expressing our anger to God, we can find more constructive ways of handling our anger and even directing it in ways that lead towards justice and reform and new ways of flourishing together as a community. And Guy, thank you also for lamenting, of course, the deaths that Westminster Presbyterian Church has suffered among its members and family members of the members of Westminster Pres. That is, for many pastors, one cause of lament is not being able to conduct in-person funerals during this time. So another thing to be despairing, lamenting, even angry about. Walter Bruggeman, whose name you may know, he used to teach at Columbia Seminary before he retired, wrote a wonderful series of essays on the Psalms. He actually has his own commentary out now, co-authored with William Ballinger. But he once made the outrageous statement that if the church, he said that the church has lost the art of lamenting. And again, I mean, we're into confessing sin, but we don't do much lamenting liturgically. I mean, can you imagine reading together Psalm 13 as an introduction to lamenting about COVID, as this student did? But we just don't do lamenting. And he says that because the church has lost the art of lament, more of us go see psychotherapists and psychologists than ever before. Or to turn it this way around, if the church had been able to continue the art of lament that we gain from the Psalms, then there would be a lot less need to see the psychotherapist. His point is that the lament is a good thing for us. It's for our good to lament, to express our rage and anger towards God in protest. Something to think about. What would it be? How would Westminster Presbyterian Church craft a corporate lament to be read in worship sometime? That might be a really interesting exercise. And speaking of corporate laments, there are plenty of those in the Psalms as well. And I lift up to you Psalm 44. And it begins with, the first three verses begin with this recounting a little bit of how the ancestors have preserved a legacy of the history of God's redemption and salvation from the Exodus. And then in verse 4, which I want to read to you and following, we hear this address to God. You indeed are my king, O God, who commands victories for Jacob, though you we thrust through you. We thrust away our foes. By your name, we have trampled our adversaries. Indeed, I trust not in my bow. My sword does not save me, for it is you who saved us from our foes, and you have put to shame those who hate us. In God, we glory always. We give thanks to your name forever. So this opening section of Psalm 44 gives praise and thanksgiving to God for having saved people from peril back in earlier times. Again, verse 8, in God we glory always. We give thanks to your name forever. And then look for the turn that begins in verse 5. But alas, you have spurned and debased us. You do not go out with our armies. You turn us back from the foe, and our enemies plunder us. You hand us over as sheep for slaughter. You have scattered us among the nations. You sell your people short. You have not increased their worth. You make us the butt of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a headshaker among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and the shame of my face has covered me at the sound of the taunting despiser, at the sight of the enemy avenger. And the speaker is not done. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you. We have not broken your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor has any of our steps strayed from your way, but you crushed us in the abode of the sea monster, covering us with deep darkness. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to some strange deity, would not God have found it out? For God knows the secrets of the heart. No, it is because of you that we are being slain every day. We are reckoned as slaughtered sheep. These words are tough. They are filled with outrage directed to God. And notice here, there is no confession of sin. Instead, the community in prayer, in this communal lament, is telling God, we have kept up our end of the covenant. We're the ones not at fault here. You are, oh God. Then finally, these commanding words, wake up. Why do you sleep, my Lord? Awaken. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face, forgetting our affliction and oppression? Indeed, we sink down into the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Arise, be of help to us. Redeem us on account of your benevolence. No confession of sin. It's all outrage. And it begins in praise. And in a way, the psalm functions to remind God who God used to be. God was the one who saved us from peril, from enemy attack, but not anymore. This is brutal honesty directed to God. The Psalms, the Lament Psalms in particular, are all about being honest to God and honest with each other. So here's what Walter Bruggeman has to say about the costly loss of lament in the church. He says, where the capacity to initiate lament is absent, one is left only with praise and doxology. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like not praising God? Are there been moments where you feel you just were unable to praise God, to enter into doxological praise? That's a redundancy. Are there moments in which you don't feel like praising God? I suspect there have been moments, and there will be moments. And the lament is to pick up those times in which we are incapable of praising God because life has become so hard. And the Psalms of Lament tell us we can still talk to God. We can still praise to God, even without praise. But if we lose the art of lament, if we lose the, if you will, the lament muscle in our prayer life, then all we have left is praise. And much of that praise will be, shall I say it, fake praise, false praise, empty praise. The Psalms testify that the only way to get to praise is through the gauntlet of lament. Because then on the other side of lament, you have reason to praise. There's something else that Bruggeman says. The absence of lament makes a religion of coercive obedience the only possibility. Now that statement is a bit more pointed than the first statement. Without lament, then religion, then church is more about coercive obedience than true, genuine, heartfelt faith. Lament, and here's the other side of lament. Lament is a way of protesting to God, perhaps protesting to each other. Lament functions as a protest to God. It is the Bible's protest literature, the lament in the Psalms. And without the freedom to protest, then what you have left is coercion. Wow. I still wrestle with that statement from Bruggeman, but I think he's onto something there. He's basically exposing the freedom of lamenting. To lament to God is an expression of freedom toward God. And God wants us to be free. God wants us to be honest. God welcomes all of our emotions from lament to praise.
Bill, if I could jump in just for a second.
Please.
The book that I'll give people who are lamenting is Ann Weems' Psalms of Lament. And encourage that same kind of faithful movement of externalizing the lament. I find her, and of course, that was Walter's encouragement of her
Yes.
to do that after the tragedy in her family.
Yes.
So
I think that's an excellent resource, Guy. Yes, I would encourage everyone to take advantage of that resource. Excellent, excellent. Here are a couple other things that Bruggeman says about the Psalms of Lament. If I can get us back going. All right, here we go. The Psalms of Lament acknowledge that things are not right in the present arrangement of things. And secondly, they need not stay this way, but can be changed. The lament is, you might say the lament is one side of the serenity prayer, right? The things that cannot be changed to be at peace with, but to change the things that can be changed. And the lament is actually an empowering mode of becoming a change agent. The speaker will not accept them in this way, for it is deemed intolerable. And fourth, it is God's obligation to change things. That's the assumption of the psalmist. I would add another thing, a fifth thing, and it may turn out that it is our obligation to change things. Maybe in our lament, maybe more often than not, God is telling us how we can change things, what needs to be done to change things in the present moment, in the present arrangement for such a time as this. All right, well, we've looked at Psalm 13, which is an individual psalm, and we looked at a corporate Psalm of Lament, Psalm 44. I want now to conclude with perhaps the most offensive, troubling lament psalm in the Psalter, a psalm of sorrow, Psalm 137. And its beginning will sound familiar. It's been put to music in different ways. It is a very poignant psalm here as it opens. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. So these first three verses conjure the scene of exile. Those who were deported and enslaved in Babylon. Once the Babylonian armies destroyed Jerusalem and razed the temple to the ground, and then deported thousands upon thousands of Israelites for them to be of service to their overlords. And in this case, the rivers of Babylon are actually canals that needed dredging and cleaned. And so here the speaker counts himself as one of the laborers, conscripted laborers, to clean out, to dredge the rivers of Babylon, the canals of Babylon, and complains of his despair, weeping, remembering Zion, their home, Jerusalem. But now they have he and his colleagues, his fellow laborers, have no intention of singing songs of Zion, even though they are demanded to do so by their captors. It reminds me of the enslaved South, of Blacks who were enslaved and spent all day picking cotton or doing other hard labor on the farm. And then in the evening, the slaveholders would ask them to sing and dance for their entertainment. It's sort of the same thing that's going on here as well. The psalmist continues, how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. So now the psalmist is concerned about forgetting Jerusalem that seems so distant geographically and in time. But the statement that declared as a self-oath, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my hand wither. I will not forget you, Jerusalem. Even as the psalmist refuses to sing for joy regarding Zion in Jerusalem, as his captors demanded. So this sense of anguish and lament and despair is the first half of Psalm 137. But the psalmist continues, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites on the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, how happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. How commendable shall be the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. I suspect you haven't heard much the end of Psalm 137. And although you may be familiar with the beginning of the psalm, when Psalm 137 is read responsively or is captured in a hymn, of which there are many, these last few verses are always left out, and perhaps for good reason. It's almost as if the psalmist now is commending infanticide against the Babylonians. But there's reason for that, because behind the scenes, you get a sense that the psalmist is aware of having suffered the same thing. He remembers, or perhaps she remembers. Maybe it's a mother here who is uttering this lament. One who has witnessed maybe the death of her own child, her own infant in arms, thrown against the wall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And now wishes the same thing for her captors, to experience the same anguish. The psalm is a psalm of vengeance, a cry for avenging the injustice and suffering suffered by a community destroyed, deported, displaced. And it ends in this horrific note. And that's in the Bible too. And what do we do with a psalm of this sort? I cannot read it. To be frank, I cannot sing this psalm because, in part, I've not experienced this level of suffering as the psalmist has, or as African Americans have, or as others who have been displaced and deported and suffer so in a foreign land. As a person of white privilege, I cannot sing this song. And so I'm of a different opinion from those who say we must pray all the Psalms of the Psalter. The Psalms are meant to be prayed by everyone. I would say, but can you pray Psalm 137? I can't. I won't. And yet, I do have to read it. I do have to listen to it. And so I would say this, is that it's okay if you can't sing all the Psalms in the Psalter. It's okay if you can't sing the Psalms of praise when you're not feeling like praising. And it is okay not to sing or read or pray this psalm, Psalm 137, simply because you haven't experienced anything that resembles what the psalmist has experienced. But I would also say you should still read it. You should still come to understand it, because some of these psalms are said by others who have experienced this suffering, and it is your role to listen to it and to figure out perhaps how you can change this situation. This psalm is a protest against the Babylonian Empire. It is a psalm that reminds us what imperial oppression is going on in our world today, even perhaps on our own soil, as it has been in the history of the United States of America. This is a psalm that demands attention from those of us who are privileged to not have experienced such anguish. It is a psalm to listen from the lips of another sufferer, of someone else, and then to act accordingly. So, I end with something of a shocker in the Psalter, a shocker in the Psalter. And it's all about entering into dialogue with God here at the end. And sometimes our dialogue, our conversations with God need to begin with lament, because that's where we are, some more than others. But it's okay to start that conversation with God in lament, even in protest, even in anger, and certainly in sorrow. And then to maintain that conversation, to keep talking to God and to keep listening, and to keep listening to each other. And you'll find that you'll continue to move. And in the end, as the Psalter itself testifies, in the end, we will all have plenty of reason to give praise to God. Praise is the endpoint. It is the goal. But sometimes that praise cannot be reached except through the crucible of lament. And that's a good thing too. We need to lament. It's good for us. And the Psalms testify to that in so many vivid ways. So that's the lament psalm, the most dominant, the most popular form of the Psalms in the Psalter, in case you didn't know, but now you do. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Bill. We're so grateful for this. A reminder to the class that Bill will be with us again for the third of his classes, but it won't be next week. It will be the 27th. Next week, we'll have the president of Belmont College, Greg Jones, and we'll all be in the fellowship hall then. God bless you, friend. Thank you so much. And good luck with the Psalms next week.
Thank you, Guy. And please give my regards to Greg Jones. We go back many years ago. We've lost touch with each other, but give him my regards. Tell him that he is a suitable replacement for me next Sunday.
Peace. Bye, Bill.
All right, peace.